This is Duke University.
All black, everything, everything black, culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are joined today by Richard J. Powell, the John Spencer Bassett Professor of Art, Art History, and Visual Studies here at Duke University, and the curator of the new show focused on the work of Archibald Motley. How are you doing today, Nick?
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about Archibald Motley. You know, his use of colors are so striking that there are many folks that know they've seen a Motley before, even if they don't know much about him. So talk a little bit about why an exhibition around Motley's work at this time.
Well, as you said, his works are iconic. Yeah. They're paintings that one sees if you just Google Harlem Renaissance or Jazz Age, you will see paintings by Archibald Motley. His works are also provocative, and I kind of felt that in 2014, this was a good opportunity to look at his work in depth and to think about his important contributions in the early 20th century as a backdrop for thinking about contemporary art and its explorations of race and identity and culture and provocation and the like.
Talk a little bit about Motley in relationship to, you know, the Black community. There's a vernacular quality to his work, but he's also classically trained. Talk a little bit about when we compare him to other African-American artists. Immediately I think about, you know, the show that you curated a few years ago on Barclay Hendricks. You know, these are not necessarily run-of-the-mill artists, you know, folks that immediately we think about, you know, when we think about their names. But where do they fit into a kind of pantheon of African-American Black artists, you know, either here in the United States or globally?
I would say that when Motley comes into his own as an artist, which is in the 1920s, the artists who preceded him, figures like Henry Ossawa Tanner, Edmonia Lewis, etc. I mean, these were very fine academically trained artists, but they were very conflicted about how they would represent African Americans. Yeah. Archibald Motley had no qualms, had no problems with immersing himself in the Black community and representing people through portraiture, representing the streets and the urban life as genre paintings, or even thinking about ideas like the blues or urban life and the demi-monde, the kind of gut bucket elements of popular culture, and representing that on canvas. And so that was his pioneering and the thing that really identifies him as a forward-thinking artist.
How much of that had to do with his background growing up in New Orleans?
Well, he actually left New Orleans at the age at a very young age, maybe about 4 or 5. And he moved with his family to Chicago. But when you have parents from New Orleans, you tend to kind of carry their stuff with you in terms of the food, in terms of the joy of life. His father was a Pullman porter, so that means he had access to a lot of information all around America. His mother was a former school teacher, but she was like energy and love and support for the arts personified. So she not only supported him, which was kind of unusual, a middle-class family encouraging their oldest son to go into art.
Not to be a doctor or a lawyer, right, or a preacher.
But then she has a grandson, Willard Motley, who becomes a major novelist during that time period. So this is an unusual family of Black Chicagoans / New Orleans folks who really push and promote their children to go deep into the arts and to succeed as artists.
Well, let's take a look at the show.
Great. Okay.
Motley was known, among other things, not just for his self-portraits, but his portraits. Here we have 2 portraits that he did of his grandmother. How significant was she, you know, in his world, and why did he feel compelled, you know, to capture her?
He had a studio at home on the top floor of a home, a frame house, and her bedroom was right next to his studio. Okay. This woman was 80 years old at the time that, in the 1920s, when these paintings were done. And it may seem ironic that this artist who celebrates modernity, who looks at the jazz life, would take time out to paint 2 incredible portraits of this 80-some-year-old woman, this ex-slave. Right. And yet, when we look at these pictures, we see an incredible empathy and connection with her. And when we look at a picture like this,
Yeah.
I mean, I see this woman as a modern woman.
Yes,
I mean,
right,
she's
right.
known slavery.
Right.
She's known the past. She's known violence. She's known hard work.
Yeah.
And yet she looks straightforward
It's a forward looking, right?
at
yeah,
us
yeah.
with a kind of resolve.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so this is facing the 20th century in a remarkable way.
He had a particular eye for women.
Yeah.
Whether, a portrait of his mother or his grandmother or, those kind of light-skinned, big-legged women that show up all the time, in some of his paintings.
Motley loved women. And I think that, like many artists, he sees women as the perfect subject in terms of beauty, in terms of desire, in terms of complexity.
Yeah.
So we have images of these mixed-race women. We have nudes that are very kind of complicated, images that have to do with spectatorship and what have you, pictures of his mother, pictures of his grandmother. I think that one of the things this show helps us understand is that one can reassess his work and think about his relationship to women and larger issues of representations of gender in a new way.
Yeah. We're here with Rick Powell, eminent art historian and curator here of this new show on Archibald Motley here at the Nasher Museum. And tell me a little bit, when you think about Motley's work, right, and we know the time that he spent in Paris, right, but he also spent a significant amount of time in Chicago, and the kind of networks that he's connected to and capturing, what we call the Chitlin circuit. How important was it for him to capture this kind of everydayness of Black life?
I think that's what really distinguishes Archibald Motley as a major figure in 20th century Black culture. This is a moment when the NAACP and various figures in the African American cognoscenti are kind of celebrating the elites, those who are educated, those who went to college, those who put a wonderful face forward for Black Americans. And Motley was interestingly a part of that cohort.
Yeah, right.
On the other hand, I think he realizes that artistically, in order for him to be a premier Black modernist, he was going to have to, investigate, interrogate Black popular culture.
Right, realism. Right.
Exactly, real realism in terms of the churches, in terms of the blues, in terms of just the pool rooms, the streets themselves. Yeah. And he does, I think, one of the most remarkable interrogations of that. And other people follow him in that interest, Jacob Lawrence and Catlett, but no one does it like Archibald Motley.
He's very much visually in conversation with what we see in literature with Langston Hughes at this period of time, folks like Zora Neale Hurston. And I imagine there was quite a bit of pushback, from folks who are concerned about putting the best face, the best image forth of the Black community. How are they feeling about these paintings of pool halls, of folks getting sanctified, in church spaces?
Well, the pushback was, I'd say, from kind of the Black intelligentsia. On the other hand, I think a lot of people in the white art community were kind of marveling at these amazing paintings, not so much about the folk elements in them, but his use of color. I mean, his use of expressionistic form and visual dynamism. And those pieces seem to connect with people outside of the Black community, so much so that he's exhibiting in New York City in the 1920s. He's exhibiting in Munich and Copenhagen and Stockholm in the 1930s. He's getting awards. And so he really becomes a kind of a major figure in modern American art during this time period.
How are everyday Black folks receiving this work? I mean, there's been running jokes, for instance, in terms of the contemporary art world, that many everyday Black folks don't have access to what folks might define as the great contemporary Black artists. And it's this much more vernacular art, velvet pictures, those kind of things. Yeah. I imagine that part of his appeal, particularly in this generation, was that, everyday folks saw themselves in those paintings in ways that they might not have saw themselves in the work of some other Black artists.
I think so. I think the other part of it is that when you are in the middle of culture, living culture, being culture, you're not necessarily plugged into the art world per se. Right. And so while I'm sure there were those who might have worked their way into the Art Institute of Chicago or the YMCA on the south side of Chicago and might have seen these images like this one of people at a sanctified church service. And they might have said, very interesting. Yeah. But at the same time, when you're in the middle of living the life of culture and being, you know, you don't necessarily need the artwork to confirm your existence. Well, part of the challenge of Archibald Motley is that early scholarship kind of created him as this kind of noble, kind of gentleman. Yeah. And he was a gentleman. Yeah. But you can't do works like this and be distant.
Right. You got to be in these spaces.
You have to be in these spaces. And he is in all of these paintings. He is walking the streets. He's checking out the ladies. He's, you know, listening to the music. He's also just absorbing the pulse and the energy of the stroll. This is Chicago, on 35th Street between State and Cottage Grove. And so he's watching all of the action in the community. And then going back to his studio and then reimagining it in a modernistic way.
We're here with Rick Powell, eminent art historian, professor here at Duke University. When you talk about Motley, right, and Motley's someone who travels the world, but he also embeds himself in Chicago. And, you know, in the 20s and the 30s, there's a lot of focus on the Harlem Renaissance, but Chicago's having its own Renaissance, right? He chose to bring his visual eye to Chicago. Talk a little bit about the work that he does in Chicago. Talk about, you know, what it meant for him to capture the stroll. You know, this great, you know, avenue where all this action is happening in Black Chicago in the 20s and the 30s.
Yeah, he's aware of the activity going on in Harlem. In fact, he exhibits in Harlem in the 1920s and is patronized by major Harlem patrons. Yeah. But I think he realizes that there's something special happening on the south side of Chicago, that this confluence of migrants from Mississippi and the Delta, and also businesses, Black businesses like Black newspapers and Black churches. It's a different energy than on the East Coast. There's a kind of a combination of entrepreneurial spirit and this kind of gut bucket spirituality and folk culture that comes up the Mississippi and makes itself known on the South Side. And he's a witness to that. He's not just a witness, he's a participant in it.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting dynamic. There's a part of him, particularly when you see the self-portraits, there's this kind of investment in Black respectability, but you can't, you know, do these paintings unless you're in there with these communities. Right?
Absolutely.
You're sharing a drink with them, having conversations with them. I mean, as an artist, how important is it to really embed yourself in communities that way?
I think it's very important. And I think that in these paintings, if you don't see an actual picture of him, what you do see are other witnesses. Right. This fat man, you know, he's always in every picture. And I see that as Archibald Motley. I mean, he becomes a kind of a surrogate for the artist who absorbs everything. He sees and hears
and he's listening.
And listens, and that he pops up again and again from one painting to another. So you'll always find in these urban pictures, I would call like testifiers, witnesses, folks who may not be a part of the hubbub, but they are very much present and are taking into account the culture.
Why do you think there has not been enough light shed on Black Chicago during this period? I know DeVarian Baldwin has done some great work about it. Lots of other folks. I mean, everything always centers on Harlem, right? And at least in the contemporary moment, we talk about Atlanta in that way. Why hasn't Black Chicago, you know, even with the Obama presidency, not getting the kind of shine, if you will, that it deserves?
You know, I think it actually goes back to the early 20th century when these cities are coming into their own. And New York is the centerpiece for media and all sorts, and it's kind of like the marketplace of culture. And that doesn't mean that culture is not happening in other places. It just means that when it comes time to market and promote, you know, Manhattan becomes the place. The flip side of that is that there are a lot of artists who come from Chicago and make their way to New York and make their names. Richard Wright, Katherine Dunham, Louis Armstrong, and Archibald Motley Jr. These are all artists who kind of get their acts together, realize something quite extraordinary is happening in Black culture on these streets, and then they go to New York and they market that culture.
We're here with eminent art historian Rick Powell, Duke University professor, talking about the new Archibald Motley show that he has curated here at the Nasher Museum at Duke University. Yeah, I think there was a Harlem Renaissance collection that I remember where I first saw this painting. And it just always stuck with me. Almost felt like a Motley expert, whenever I would see it. You're here watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined by Richard T. Powell, eminent art historian, Duke University professor, talking about the new Archibald Motley show that he is curating here at the Nasher Museum at Duke University. Again, one of the running themes about Motley is that he traveled the world. And of course, he spent some time in Paris. An earlier period of time when we typically think about Black expatriates, right? When folks like Wright and Baldwin and all these folks are there in the 1950s. He's there at an earlier period, but he's also there at the same time that Josephine Baker is there. How did his experience in Paris, impact his art? I mean, of course, we see the work that he produces there, but as he's kind of thinking about himself as an artist, as a Black artist, how important was his Paris experience?
Well, you raised a really interesting question, because on one hand, to be in Paris in the 1920s is like the destination. All these Black writers and artists in US want to follow in the footsteps of Josephine Baker and Langston Hughes and experience kind of freedom for the first time on the streets of Paris. And Motley's a part of that group. Yeah. What's interesting about Motley is that he doesn't hang out with that crowd. He is not a part of a social network of other Black artists. And there are quite a few. William H. Johnson is there, Hale Woodruff is there, Palmer Hayden. He doesn't hang out with any of those guys. He really stays in his studio. He works incessantly. But he does party. He does go out at night, because he wrote a diary, which we have. Yeah. And he talks about getting up in the morning and shaving and getting breakfast and cleaning his brushes and working on this canvas, working on that canvas. And then around 9 o'clock, he says, okay, it's time to get some red wine. Yeah. It's time to meet up with my model friend, Miss Zaida. And then they go to clubs like Les Coupoles and Cosmos and I think La Bal Negra, which is the subject of this painting, Blues. And he's hanging out, interestingly, with a lot of people from the Caribbean, folks from Martinique and Guadeloupe, as well as Senegalese, French-speaking Black folks. Yeah. And since he's from New Orleans, he probably maybe felt some kindredness with those folks.
How long was he in Paris?
He arrives in 29 and he leaves early mid-November, 1930. Yeah. So it's not a total year, but it's an intense year.
And it's interesting timing, right? Because the Harlem Renaissance, the energy around it's beginning to wind down at that period of time.
Well, that's even questionable. Yeah. The 30s are a really interesting moment. Yes, there's not a lot of money around, but there are quite a few musicians who hang in there, become a part of that
scene.
Person
makes their name in it.
Exactly. And but it's at 1930 he decides to come back and really immerse himself back in Chicago.
One of the things that's striking about all of Motley's work is his use of colors.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit, particularly in a painting like Blues?
Oh, this is a masterpiece. Yeah. I know that sounds like hyperbole, but the way he uses color really sophisticatedly, the reds and the greens and the blues, kind of spaced ever so elegantly. This rainbow of colored people, who are brown and yellow and purple.
Small, thick. Right?
Yeah, exactly. The way he does rhythms and patterns of bodies, the way he inserts the musical instruments, the way he drops in these elements that say jazz in terms of the musical instruments, but also images or objects that say Paris, red wine, the cigarette. The dangling foot that pops out at the bottom of this piece. I mean, it's just an incredible amalgam of modernist ideas, jazz-inflected ideas, and it just makes it an extraordinary painting to experience.
If you have to mention any contemporary artists that you think are really taking a great deal from Motley's legacy these days, who would you think of?
Well, since we've had the show up, several people have mentioned Ernie Barnes, who's
Durham, right?
Amazing artist from Durham, North Carolina.
Vernacular work, right?
Exactly. Life. You got it. You know. So, and actually, Romy Bearden to some extent. I mean, we think about Bearden as a collagist, but if you look at a painting like this and think about this as fractured spaces or bodies that have been cut up and reassembled, this is the precursor to the actual collage that Bearden will deploy in the 1960s. So Motley is a model for a lot of artists.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with art historian Richard J. Powell talking about this new show that he's curated here at the Nasher Museum about Archibald Motley and his work.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back. Black